Good afternoon, everyone. Since I prepared the slides in English, I'll be speaking English. I think the three things that are necessary for decarbonization, eventually achieving carbon neutrality. Number one, policies. We have talked a lot about that. And the number two, technology, which of course, including digital technology. And third thing is finance. Back 10 years ago, nearly 10 years ago, when I was in the Chinese Central Bank working on the green financial policy, we estimated that China needed like 4 trillion RMB per year for green financing, green investments, for dealing with pollution, decarbonization, and for circular economy. Now, we estimate that we need 16 trillion RMB per year. And the majority of these financing sources need to be mobilized by the private sector. The government actually only has 10% of that resources. Globally, I think the same thing. A lot of people are saying we need a multi-trillion US dollar per year for carbon action. Some even put number to 2.5 trillion per year. I guess Albert probably knows many of these numbers. And again, I think in emerging markets, developing country, roughly 90% of these have to come from the market, private sector. While OECD country, could be slightly bigger than 10%. So really, I think the global community, of course, a lot of country regulators have spent a lot of time last 10 years thinking about how to set up a financial system that's able to mobilize enough funding for green activities or sustainable activities. So let me talk about sort of achievements in the past 10 years in that effort. This is China. We started a fairly low number of green financing. That's about 5 trillion outstanding green loans. And actually, at that time, we don't have green bonds yet. It's only 5 trillion green loans. And by then, in the middle of this, we began our green bond market. And I'm using this aggregate number, outstanding green loans and green bonds, to sort of measure the growth of Chinese green finance market. It's now 25 trillion right now. And by end of this year, I'm estimating something like 30 trillion RMB worth of outstanding green loans and green bonds. Massive growth. This growth is much faster than GDP, right? We had a 3% GDP last year, but we had a 38% growth in green loans. And this is partly driven by the demand for green activities and decarbonization, and partly driving the activities. In fact, the bank's actually telling what the corporates should do in order to get my money. This is global numbers. It's coming largely from CBI, but a little bit of my estimates showing that the global green bond market, which is an aggregate sort of concept. I use green to include sustainable social bonds and so on. And started with a very, very low number, something like 100 billion back nearly 10 years ago, and now it's a trillion in terms of annual issuance. And still, this is a very small number relative to the total size of the global finance market, and we need to scale up many, many more fold from here in the coming decades. And there are many issues that we need to address within the green financial system, both domestically in China and internationally. Now, I'm going to speak about 3 international issues. I'm leaving some of the domestic sort of private sector issues for other occasions. And these are the 3 global challenges which really were largely discussed under the G20 framework. I had the honor to co-chair the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group, which early on was called Green Finance Study Group. It was set up in 2016 when China was the presidency of G20. And the first summit was held here in Hangzhou. As I think in the hotel TV, a lot of pictures on the first G20 summit, Chinese hosted, and in which we actually presented the first global consensus on scaling up green finance in Hangzhou. So last few years, we've been focusing on some of these issues. Number one, we have too many definitions of green activities or sustainable activities. And in fact, I guess there might be 200 taxonomies globally, meaning 200 languages really defining what green is by different countries, different organizations. Some are done by country authorities. I think maybe 30-something countries have official taxonomies defining green, and many others by NGOs like CBI, and many are done by the banks, by the insurance company, by asset management company, pension funds, and so on. Now, this is like one community speaking 200 different languages, which creates many problems. Number one, it creates market segmentation. A Chinese green bond recognized by Chinese standards may not be recognized by the European investors. They think your green is not my green. And secondly, increase the transaction cost. If my green bond, for example, produced in China, wants to be sold both in China and in Europe, I need to get double verification. I need to get another verifier verifying against the European standard. If I need to sell to the third market, I need to get third verification. That's additional transaction cost. And the third problem is that increases the risk of greenwashing. If there are 200 definitions of green, then someone may pick the lowest standard to label my activity and claiming I'm the green guy. So all these problems need to be addressed with international coordination. Cannot be done by a single country because these are really country-to-country negotiation. And the second problem at the global level is proliferation of sustainability reporting standards. We ask the issuers of the green financial products, whether it's green loans or green bonds, to tell their investors that you are doing green things, right? So you have green environmental benefits. I'm reducing carbon, reducing air pollution, reducing water pollution, reducing damage to nature and biodiversity. And, but each country has different rules on the reporting, the indicator, the format, and the meaning of specific indicators. If just imagine you are a global fund manager running a portfolio of 30 different bonds coming from 30 countries, and each bond is reporting against the domestic reporting standards, then you cannot compare which company or security's green performance is really better than the others. And that creates a lot of problems as well. Because of lack of consistent reporting standards, we need to harmonize it. That's a second global effort. And thirdly, in the past 10 years, as I showed you these two charts, China green finance growing massively, global green finance growing massively, but these are green finance. Green finance are defined by what we call green taxonomies. And what are contained in green taxonomies? They are largely what we call pure green activities. Essentially, in the climate space, we're talking about renewable energy, electric vehicle, batteries, and so on. They have not supported enough the transition activities that should be taking place in, for example, steel, cement, petrochemical, coal-fired power generation, transportation, and all of these carbon-intensive sectors. And how much these activities are, I think they're much, much bigger than pure green activities. The pure green in China is 10% of GDP. And the rest of the 90% are non-green, and the majority of that are transitional economies that need financing. And they're not covered, or at least not covered properly by the green financial system. That's why a big challenge is how to guide global private sector money to support transition activities. So these are the three major global challenges to the next phase of sustainable finance development. And I'm going to tell you the recent agreements at international level, some at the G20 level. Number one, we decided to enhance the comparability, interoperability of, at the G20 level, we call alignment approach, including taxonomy. That's aimed at addressing the problem I just mentioned, the proliferation of taxonomies leading towards market segmentation, greenwashing, transaction costs, and so on. A specific effort in that direction is the China-European-led Common Ground Taxonomy under the IPSF. IPSF is an international platform set up about 4 years ago called International Platform for Sustainable Finance. It was initiated by Europe, China joined, and many other countries. And under that platform, China proposed, and later on it was established, a working group to produce a common taxonomy, which is recognized both by EU and China. Why EU and China? Because at the time, only EU and China were the two large economies with taxonomy, about to have a taxonomy. So we talk to each other, say, hey, can we, start with a common language, and maybe gradually we can spread in the practice to the rest of the world. It was very successful. I had the honor to co-chair this Common Ground Taxonomy Working Group in the past 3.5 years. We produced one version of the Common Taxonomy, which looks like this. And it's recognized both by EU and China. They cover 72 climate mitigation activities, including all kinds of renewables, EVs, batteries, green transportation, net zero buildings, and so on. And now it's being used. A lot of Chinese issuers have issued green bonds internationally using the Common Ground Taxonomy as a label. It was successful. And the next phase is that we're going to expand the country basis of the Common Ground Taxonomy. Singapore just raised a hand, they joined. And I think the next phase of the CGT, or Common Ground Taxonomy, will be based not only on China and Europe, but also Singapore and some other countries. And over time, I think the Common Taxonomy will become a basis of global interoperability for green definition. So that's a direction, very long term, and hopefully we can, enhance the connectivity of global green finance markets through the adoption of the Common Taxonomy as a basis for many, many taxonomy using what we call CGT plus approach. Each taxonomy will contain the Common Ground Taxonomy as a major building block and add something else that they need. Now, my question on digital usage is that for a long period of time, before we reach sort of a eventual harmonization or interoperability, we will live with a few hundred taxonomies, a few hundred definitions of green products. And how do we use digital technology to provide labels of green products, let's say from China, against the different taxonomies? Now, some Chinese green products, maybe green bonds, green loans, green ETF, green ABS, green something else, may actually be consistent with many, many other taxonomies. It's already qualified Europeans and maybe 10 other jurisdictions taxonomy. Can you push a button and it will show you that this is actually consistent with all of these, and you can sell in all these markets. And this is not something we can do manually. It's a very complex database and mapping and probably even AI. And we need that kind of service in order to enhance the global green finance flows cross-border. That's my point number one. Second point, against one of the challenges, I think second challenge I mentioned, reporting standards. A solution has been raised, which is ISSB, International Sustainability Standard Board. It was launched about 1.5 years ago after it was endorsed by the G20 as the globally recognized consistent reporting standard for sustainability going forward. And ISSB is expected to release its global standard by end of this month after 1.5 years consultation, which is great. And I just met the chairman of IFIS. IFIS set up the ISSB. I met the chairman Erkki a couple of days ago in Beijing, and I know that the ISSB chairman is coming to Hong Kong a couple of weeks' time coming to Hong Kong. So they are promoting the adoption and usage globally. Now, the problem of that is ISSB standard is considered as very complex, very costly, very cumbersome by many developing country emerging markets, especially by SMEs. And some SMEs say, hey, looks like I'm going to spend $500,000 to be in compliance with the ISSB, and my profit is only $500,000. How can I do that? So really, the implementation of ISSB, which hopefully will form one global standard for reporting, needs digital solutions for SMEs. I think for the majority of SME, we need something like reducing the cost of reporting from 1 million RMB to 1,000 RMB. And from data, capture for calculation of all these, results, and for the data that provide the parameters, and for the format that needed for submission to the regulators and to investors, all these things need to be automated. And it really presents a lot of opportunities, I think, for digital solution providers. The third challenge I mentioned is transition finance. I think transition finance is actually much more difficult than green finance. Why? The green stuff are relatively easy to identify. You look at this, the wind, a lot of sunshine, solar, it's like that. And the biomass, right? But most of the transition activities, they involve many, many technologies and to be used by carbon-intensive companies like steel, cement, and they're not easily recognizable by average people, especially by investors. And it's much easier to fake, to do what we call transition washing, than to greenwashing. And that's why a framework is needed to scale up the transition finance market at the same time preventing transition washing. And this is an effort the G20 made last year. In fact, the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group spent roughly 9 months in the last year working on this document of G20 Transition Finance Framework. And we came up with a framework by November last year, and it was endorsed by G20 leaders in Bali, in Indonesia. So it was a very important milestone, setting the the principles for many countries to translate into actions, including regulations, reporting standards, and also specific products. Now, let me just briefly mention these 5 pillars stated in the G20 Transition Finance Framework. Number 1, we need ways to identify transition activities. It's not something you claim as transition, but I need to make sure that they are actually consistent with standards set up either by regulator or verified by specialists. So there are 2 ways to do that. One is what we call taxonomy approach, which the Chinese central banks are now doing. They are developing a transition taxonomy, which is a huge table with activities that's considered transition under steel, cement, petrochemical, and so on. So with that table, it can save the cost for a lot of investors to identify transition activities and also for the corporates. The second pillar, which is more important and more difficult, is disclosure. We need to ask the company receiving transition finance to disclose their transition plan. Not only buying one equipment for 1 year, reducing carbon by 5%, but also a plan throughout the transition period towards net zero. So really, in the next 30 years or even longer, what you're going to do, when you will do what, and the setting, short-term, medium-term, long-term targets, and at the same time, releasing information such as Scope 1, Scope 2, and if possible, Scope 3 emission data. And all these requirements are actually stronger than the green finance-related disclosure. And then product-wise, we need a lot more sort of a diverse products that we see today. Today, it's mainly debt-related products, sustainability linked loans and bonds and so on, but we also need equity, insurance, and many others. And all these products need to building incentives for the corporates to reduce carbon more aggressively than otherwise. For example, if you reduce carbon aggressively, I will give you cheap financing, reduce the basis points, by X basis points. And also, we need the policies to make sure that these transition activities become bankable. Because a lot of transition activities actually are very risky. The sort of risk-adjusted returns are low, and they're unable to attract private sector financing. Policies will be important, from fiscal, from what we call structural monetary policy, from regulations, and so on. And finally, just transition. There are a lot of meanings in this category, but one important agreement in the G20 that we need to make sure that the financial sector has to play a role to minimize the unemployment during the transition process. Now, these are a lot of contents I don't have time to elaborate, but just say that digital technology is very important to help implementing the transition finance framework, especially disclosure, because this is very difficult, very costly. From a corporate's perspective, they've been complaining already. You have putting so much of disclosure requirements for green, and now you're putting additional disclosure requirements for transition activities, and especially SMEs. I simply don't know how to disclose Scope 1, Scope 2, and they never heard of Scope 3. And please help me in reducing the cost and enable me to do that disclosure. So again, I think it creates a lot of opportunity for digital solutions. Let me stop here. Thank you very much.